Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing the moon start to bleed with fire. This was almost a reality. In 1959, the United States Army signed a secret order to detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon. They wanted the mushroom cloud to be visible to the naked eye of every single human being on Earth. This was not about science. It was the most expensive and dangerous billboard ever conceived by man. The goal was simple, yet terrifying. They wanted to burn the American flag directly into the heavens. In 1959, the United States Army decided that the Earth was no longer enough. They officially signed a document to turn the moon into a nuclear fortress. It was not a science fiction movie. It was a top-secret military objective. The Cold War was screaming toward a breaking point. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik. Washington was in a total state of panic. They believed that whoever controlled the moon would control the fate of every human being on the planet below. By the end of this journey, you will see the blueprints of the underground cities they planned to build. You will discover the terrifying reason they wanted to detonate nuclear bombs on the lunar surface. And you will see why these files stayed hidden for decades. The project was given a name that sounded like a new dawn, Project Horizon. But the reality was much darker. It was a massive 300-page report that detailed the construction of a permanent military outpost in the stars. The budget was astronomical. They were prepared to spend $6 billion in 1959 currency. That is the equivalent of over $60 billion today. They were ready to bankrupt the nation to claim the high ground of space. But here is the most disturbing part of the plan. The base was not meant for scientists. It was meant for soldiers. The Army wanted to station 12 elite personnel on the moon by 1966. They were building a space force before NASA even existed. The location was already chosen. They targeted the Sea of Clouds. It was a flat, dark plain on the lunar surface. To the Army, it was the perfect landing strip for a new kind of war. They were looking at the moon and seeing a giant aircraft carrier. But they knew they couldn't just land and start building. They needed power, massive amounts of it. And in 1959, there was only one solution that provided enough energy in the vacuum of space. They decided to bring nuclear reactors to the moon. The documents reveal that they planned to launch 2 nuclear reactors by 1964. These machines would hum in the silence of the lunar night. They would provide the life support for the men living hundreds of feet beneath the gray dust. But then, the plan took a turn that would horrify modern astronomers. They realized that a base was useless if the enemy didn't know it was there. They needed a show of force. They needed a way to tell the Kremlin that the moon now belonged to America. This led to the birth of a sub-project so insane it was labeled A119. The goal was simple but devastating. They wanted to explode a nuclear device on the moon. They wanted the resulting mushroom cloud to be visible from Earth with the naked eye. Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing a bright flash of light on the crescent of the moon. This was the intended psychological weapon. They wanted every person on Earth to know that the United States had the power to reach out and touch the heavens. But as the engineers worked on the rockets, a new shadow began to fall over the project. Someone inside the Pentagon began to ask a question that changed everything. What if the explosion didn't just scare the Soviets? What if it destroyed the moon itself? The secret memos show a growing internal conflict. Some generals were obsessed with the nuclear option. Others were terrified of the biological consequences. But the momentum of Project Horizon was already too fast to stop. The rockets were being designed. The base was no longer just a dream. It was a technical requirement. The Army had already calculated the exact number of launches needed to build the city. They were planning to send over 200 rockets into the void within just 6 years. Building a fortress on another world required a new kind of engineering. The Army turned to Wernher von Braun. He was the former Nazi scientist who had built the V-2 rocket. Now he was tasked with building the stairs to the lunar surface. Von Braun was the only man with the vision to make Project Horizon a reality. He proposed a massive rocket called the Saturn II. It was a beast of a machine. It was designed to carry tons of construction material through the atmosphere of the Earth. The plan was a masterpiece of logistics. They would use the Earth's orbit as a gas station. Rockets would meet in space to refuel before making the final jump to the moon. It was a complex dance of fire and steel that had never been attempted before. But the construction process was even more brutal than the launch. The soldiers wouldn't live in tents. They would live in pressurized cylinders buried deep in the lunar soil. They needed to hide from the deadly radiation of the sun and the freezing cold. The documents describe a world of metal and shadows. Each soldier would have a tiny living space. They would eat synthetic food and breathe recycled air. It was a prison in paradise. But these men were trained to be the ultimate guardians of the stars. The project leaders even designed the weapons. They knew that traditional guns wouldn't work in a vacuum. They developed recoilless rifles and lunar mines. They were preparing for a ground war on a surface where there was no ground to hold. But wait, it gets even more strange. The Army wasn't just worried about the Soviets. They were worried about the moon itself. They didn't know if the surface was solid rock or deep, swallowing dust. They were building a base on a mystery. They planned to send robotic scouts first. These machines would test the soil and find the best spot for the nuclear reactors. They were the pioneers of a biological invasion. The high-level briefings called it the Lunar Colonization Phase 1. The cost of each launch was estimated at $25 million. The Army planned to have a fully operational base by 1965. They were moving at a speed that NASA would never be able to match in the years that followed. But as the blueprints were finalized, the CIA began to take an interest. They realized that a military base on the moon would be the perfect listening post. They could intercept every radio signal on Earth from the silence of the lunar craters. The moon was becoming the ultimate spy satellite. The CIA and the Army began to merge their interests. The project was no longer just about missiles. It was about total information dominance. They wanted to own the sky and the data within it. But then came the first unexpected twist. The scientists involved in the nuclear testing made a discovery. They realized that a nuclear blast on the moon wouldn't look like a blast on Earth. There would be no sound, just a blinding, silent expansion of heat. This discovery changed the psychological impact. A silent explosion was less terrifying than a loud one. The generals began to argue. They needed the blast to be spectacular. They needed it to be a sign from God. The project was starting to fracture. Internal reports from 1960 reveal a growing sense of desperation. The engineers were hitting walls with the rocket technology. The budget was leaking into other secret programs, and the public was starting to ask questions about the space race. The dream of the Lunar Fortress was starting to bleed into reality. The high walls of secrecy were the only thing keeping the project alive. But a new president was about to enter the White House, and he had a very different vision for the moon. By early 1960, Project A119 had become the most controversial part of the entire plan. The scientists were divided. Some believed that nuking the moon was a scientific necessity. They wanted to study the dust kicked up by the blast. Among those scientists was a young man named Carl Sagan. Yes, the famous astronomer was once part of a team planning to blow up a piece of the moon. His job was to calculate the expansion of the dust cloud. He was measuring the scale of a catastrophe. The plan was to use a W-25 warhead. It was a small, lightweight nuclear device. It would be carried by an unmanned rocket and detonated on the terminator line. This is the border between the light and dark sides of the moon. By hitting the terminator line, the sun would illuminate the dust cloud from behind. It would make the explosion look like a glowing halo around the moon. It would be the most terrifying advertisement for American power in the history of the world. But as the countdown to the testing phase began, the military hit a terrifying problem. They realized that if the rocket failed and fell back to Earth, they would be dropping a nuclear bomb on their own people. The stakes were suddenly too high to ignore. The documents show that the risk of accidental terrestrial detonation was over 5%. That was a number the politicians couldn't live with. They were gambling with the lives of millions for a light show in the sky. The tension in the Pentagon was rising. But the generals pushed back. They argued that the Soviets were already working on their own lunar bomb. It was a game of nuclear chicken played at 300,000 miles away. Neither side wanted to be the one that backed down first. Then came the middle video revelation. The declassified files reveal that the Army had already built a secret training facility in the desert. They were teaching soldiers how to walk and fight in low gravity. They were preparing for the lunar surface in 1961. These soldiers were the ghosts of Project Horizon. They were never given names in the reports. They were only numbers. They spent months in isolation, wearing heavy, primitive spacesuits. They were the first humans to experience the silence of the void. But the nuclear spectacle was still the priority. The project leaders believed that a base without a bomb was just a target. They needed the moon to be a weapon. They began designing moon-to-Earth missiles that could hit Moscow in minutes. The logic was chilling. A missile launched from the moon would be almost impossible to detect. By the time the Soviets saw the flare, it would be too late. The moon was the ultimate invisible silo. It was the perfect checkmate in the game of war. But as the plans grew more aggressive, the international community began to whisper. Rumors of the secret testing leaked to the press. The government denied everything. They claimed they were only interested in peaceful space exploration. It was a total lie. The contrast between the public image and the secret files is staggering. While the world watched the gentle progress of the Mercury program, the Army was sharpening its nuclear knives. They were ready to scar the face of the moon forever. But the moon had its own secrets. The early robotic probes began to send back data that didn't fit the models. The surface was more hostile than they imagined. The radiation was more intense. The dream of a permanent base was becoming a technical nightmare. And then, the most unexpected turn of all occurred. A memo from the director of the CIA landed on the desk of the Secretary of Defense. It contained information about a Soviet discovery that made Project Horizon look like a childish mistake. The CIA had a mole inside the Soviet space program. The information they received was bone-chilling. The Soviets weren't just planning a base. They were planning a lunar tank, a massive armored vehicle designed to roam the lunar surface and destroy American assets. The moon was no longer a vacant lot. It was becoming a future battlefield. The United States realized that if they didn't build Project Horizon immediately, they would be evicted from the moon before they even arrived. The The race was no longer about science. The Army accelerated the timeline. They moved the base completion date to 1964. They began testing the nuclear reactors in secret facilities in Idaho. They were trying to force the technology to work, regardless of the human cost or the danger. But the logistics were starting to crumble. The Saturn rockets were exploding on the launch pads. The guidance systems were failing. The dream of a lunar empire was hitting the hard wall of physics. You can't fight the laws of nature with a military budget. In 1961, John F. Kennedy gave his famous speech. He promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The public was inspired, but behind the scenes, the military felt betrayed. Kennedy was turning their weapon into a civilian toy. The files show a secret meeting between the Army and the White House. The generals pleaded with Kennedy to keep Project Horizon alive. They told him it was the only way to ensure national security. Kennedy looked at the plans and made a historic decision. He realized that a nuclear base on the moon would trigger a war that could never be won. He decided to move the lunar mission to NASA. He wanted the moon to be a symbol of peace, not a platform for missiles. Project Horizon was officially dead. But here is the unexpected truth. When the project was canceled, the files didn't just disappear. They were absorbed by other agencies. The technology for the lunar base became the foundation for the Apollo program. The peaceful mission was built on military bones. The Saturn V rocket, the one that took Neil Armstrong to the moon, was a direct descendant of the Saturn II designed for Project Horizon. Every step we took on the lunar surface in 1969 was paid for by the secret plans of 1959. But what about the soldiers? What about the men who trained in the desert for a war in space? The records show they were reassigned to other secret programs. Many of them ended up in the early foundations of the Delta Force and other elite units. The Space Force was buried under layers of classification. The government wanted the world to forget that they ever tried to nuke the moon. They wanted the Apollo mission to be the only story people remembered. They were successful for over 40 years. But the paper trail is long. Some of the engineers kept their private diaries. They spoke of the moon base that almost was. They spoke of the nuclear reactors that are still sitting in warehouses, waiting for a mission that never came back to life. And then, in the 1990s, a group of researchers stumbled upon the original Horizon report in the National Archives. It was a 3-volume set of documents that described everything. The world finally saw the scale of the madness. The realization was shocking. We were only one political decision away from having a nuclear-armed moon. We were one launch away from a mushroom cloud in the night sky. The history of the 20th century was almost written in radioactive dust. But as the researchers dug deeper, they found a final folder. It was labeled Phase 4. It was a plan for what should happen to the base if the Earth was destroyed in a nuclear war. It was the last hope protocol for the human race. Phase 4 of Project Horizon was the ultimate contingency. The military planners realized that if the Cold War turned hot on Earth, the lunar base would be the only place left where the United States government would still exist. It was the ultimate bunker. The base was designed to be self-sustaining for 20 years. They would grow food in hydroponic gardens. They would mine the lunar ice for water. They would be the seed of America, waiting for the radiation on Earth to fade away in the silence. The documents describe a society of 12 men and 12 women. They were selected for their genetic health and their technical skills. They were the Adam and Eve of the nuclear age. It was a cold, clinical plan for the end of the world. But the psychological profiles of these candidates were disturbing. The researchers found that the candidates were chosen for their lack of empathy. The military wanted people who could watch the Earth burn through a telescope and not lose their minds. This was the dark heart of Project Horizon. It wasn't just a base, it was a life raft for the elite. While the citizens of the United States were being told to hide under their desks, the leaders were preparing a getaway to the Sea of Clouds. The betrayal was total. But the project was too expensive and too difficult to complete in time. The last hope stayed on the drawing board. But the logic of the lunar bunker didn't die with the program. It just moved into the digital age. In the 1970s, the director of the CIA reportedly ordered a review of the Horizon files. He wanted to see if the technology could be used for a secret orbital station. The moon was too far, but the Earth's orbit was just right. This led to the creation of the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. It was another secret military program that the public knew nothing about. They were building a spy station in space, using the lessons learned from the failures of Project Horizon. The secrecy was even tighter this time. They used civilian cover stories to hide the launches. They were building a military presence in the stars while the world was focused on the Vietnam War. The shadows of 1959 were still moving. But then, the most shocking truth emerged. In 1998, a former NASA official revealed that during the Apollo missions, the astronauts found something on the moon that wasn't in the official reports. They found a biological anomaly in the Sea of Clouds. The files regarding this discovery are still classified above top secret. But the whispers suggest that the moon wasn't as dead as the Army believed in 1959. They were planning to build a nuclear base on top of a mystery they didn't understand. Could this be the real reason the project was canceled? Did the military discover that the moon was already occupied? Or did they realize that their nuclear reactors would wake up something that was better left asleep in the lunar dust? The unexpected twist is that the lunar race has returned in 2025. The same players are back: the United States, Russia, and now China. And if you look at the new plans for the Artemis program, they look strangely familiar. They are building underground habitats. They are talking about nuclear power on the lunar surface. They are choosing the same landing sites as Project Horizon. It is as if the ghost of 1959 has finally come back to claim its territory. The base that was canceled 60 years ago is now the blueprint for the next decade. We are following a script that was written by men in suits who wanted to nuke the heavens. And we are doing it without asking the same questions they did. As we look at the lunar surface today, we see the same sea of clouds that the Army mapped in 1959. The craters are still there. The silence is still absolute. But the shadows are starting to move again. The new race is on. The Artemis program is the public face of the return to the moon. But the declassified files of Project Horizon tell us that there is always a secret agenda. The military hasn't forgotten the high ground. They just changed the name of the operation. Today, the Pentagon is openly talking about space superiority. They are building satellites that can destroy other satellites. They are preparing for a conflict that will take place hundreds of miles above our heads. The dream of the Lunar Fortress is alive. But there is one more thing you need to consider. The original Horizon report mentioned a signal zero. It was a frequency that the moon base was supposed to monitor. A frequency that the Army believed was coming from deep inside the lunar core. The declassified pages on Signal Zero are heavily redacted. We don't know what they heard. We don't know what they were looking for. But we know that they were terrified. And we know that they are going back to the same spot in 2026. The train to the stars has left the station. The passengers think they are explorers. But the cargo is the same as it was in 1959. Power, control, and the ability to dominate the world from the silence of the dark side. As you close this file, ask yourself one question. If the government was willing to nuke the moon 60 years ago for a psychological advantage, what are they willing to do today with technology that is 1,000 times more powerful? The secret of Project Horizon is not just about a base or a bomb. It is about the realization that history is a circle. We are repeating the mistakes of the past with more expensive tools. The Lunar Fortress is being built, one launch at a time. But this was not the only secret project from that era. While the Army was looking at the moon, the CIA was looking at the bottom of the ocean. They were building a world that was even deeper and darker than the sea of clouds. And that is a story for another time. Because once you start looking into the shadows of the stars, you realize that the shadows are also looking back at you from the depths of the earth. And they have been waiting for a very long time. This was only the beginning of the secret space race. And it is certainly not the last time they will try to play God with the heavens.